Welcome, everybody. Aesthetics of Resistance, at least for a German audience, the title of our event tonight might evoke the novel The Aesthetics of Resistance, Die Ästhetik des Widerstands, that playwright and novelist Peter Weiss published towards the end of the 70s. Weiss is known to have been a zealous supporter of the New Left. In 1967, he published an obituary of Che Guevara in a Swedish newspaper, in which he condemned the cowardice of a mere literary life. He sang the praise of Guevara, who had recently been killed in the Bolivian jungle, and opposed his choices in life to the futile existence of Western writers and intellectuals. The only right thing to do is, his conclusion, the only right thing to do is to take a gun and fight. Little wonder, literature didn't have a place in his conception. For Weiss, as for other protagonists of the '68 movement, it had to be abandoned for its counter-revolutionary effects. Weiss' call to arms is long past, and I'm only invoking it here as a snapshot within the long history of aesthetics and resistance that is as old as Western modernity, at least. Ever since the French Revolution, the debate whether literature was or should be pure or committed, engagé, subversive or supporting the status quo has never stopped. For every identification of literature and resistance, we can find an oppositional claim that denounces literature or certain branches of literature, as Weiss did, as a reactionary force. In recent years, though, this debate seems to have lost much of its drive. Nowadays, when considering the relations between aesthetics and politics, we tend to talk about the art world and the visual arts, I have the impression, much more than of literature. One question that could concern us tonight is why that has of late been the case. It is, in any case, a welcome and timely move of the organizers of this festival to run counter the current trend by inviting four of the most distinguished theorists and scholars of our day to discuss the relations between aesthetics and politics with regard to literature. In the tradition of the academies of the 18th century, who issued prize questions to tackle the major issues of the day, what is enlightenment, for example, the organizers have asked the thinkers who will sit with me on the stage tonight to give their view on the following questions. Climate crisis, financial crisis, extreme suffering in the third world, increasing erosion of democratic structures, and a globally visible strengthening of extreme right powers. The global community is facing enormous challenges. At the same time, more and more people are turning away from politics in disappointment. What meaning is ascribed to literature in this situation? Is the discourse surrounding an aesthetics of resistance still relevant? And how should we even conceive of resistance today? I am delighted and honored to welcome Armen Avanesian, Alexander Düttmann, Jack Halberstam, and Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak, who have all agreed to provide an answer. Please give them a warm applause. According to the scope and significance of the topic, we look forward to an intense evening that may last up to 4 hours. 240 minutes is the time frame that I have been allowed to let this thing last. And we will be only kicked out here at 10:30, I am informed. So, first, our authors will give their talks, respectively, which will not last much longer than 20 minutes each. Only optionally, I will allow myself to make a short single remark, hopefully clarifying, and then we move on to the next talk. And after the talks, we will take a half-hour break to refresh ourselves. We will also have a short break after the first 2 talks. And then we have a longer break. And then, and by now we're talking about 9 o'clock, I guess, we will reconvene and we will open the discussion between the 4 protagonists of the evening here on stage, between the speakers and eventually also with you, the audience. And in order to not lose any more precious time, allow me to proceed right away and present our first speaker, Jack Halberstam. He is not... Jack Halberstam is known to anyone who has been interested in gender and queer theory in recent years. He is professor of American Studies and Ethnicity, Gender Studies, and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. His many and widely acclaimed books include Female Masculinity, The Queer Art of Failure, and most recently, Gaga Feminism. He's currently working on a new book titled The Wild. Jack, please.
Good evening. Can everybody hear? Okay, at the back? I'll speak up. So thank you to the organizers of this wonderful and timely event. So I'm going to make some remarks that draw from the work that I've done on low culture and low theory, and see if we can come up with some sort of formulation of the relationship between aesthetics and resistance to kick off tonight. So let me start by saying that, for me, the literary has no privileged relationship to resistance, and the literary can as easily be the foundation of the status quo as a plan for its undoing. So over the course of the last 200 years, various proposals for cementing the relationship between aesthetics and resistance have come to grief. For example, the modernist investment in difficulty turned out to be as likely to support fascist orientations as anything resembling radical resistance. And any belief in the unwavering relationship between truth and goodness and beauty, or between ethical behavior and education, has been sorely tested in the 20th century and largely disintegrated in post-World War II Europe. So to state the obvious then, it's very hard in an increasingly mediatized world to place any specific value on the literary. And, and I'm going to argue that we shouldn't be nostalgically pining for the literary and sneering at the new media that come to us in the form of screens and animations, digital worlds and virtual realities. That will just sort of, put a traditional understanding of aesthetics back in place. So, under these new conditions and with these new media, what does seem very clear is that we have to rethink aesthetics and resistance altogether. We can't just go back to the Frankfurt School and look for high degrees of difficulty, for example. We're going to have to think very carefully about what resistance might look like in a virtual marketplace of ideas, art, politics, and rebellion. Now, the other piece of my argument, however, that I really want to stress is that it would also be foolhardy to propose that there is no such thing as resistance, right? I mean, there's a sort of quietude or quietism to that claim as well, which I'll give examples of people who make that claim. So it would be foolish to argue that there's no place that neoliberalism and its incorporative logics do not reach, no act of refusal that can't be twisted into consent. And so you could see, for example, that there was something new in the recent Occupy movement. In the Occupy movements, activism was not so invested in this active and propulsive march through the streets, but it was quite interested in these new forms of resistance that came in the form of passivity, a sort of passive, quiet resistance of refusal. And it's no accident that in some of the Occupy events, people would sit and do marathon readings of Bartleby the Scrivener, remember Melville's clerk who prefers not to, and thereby stages a particular mode of resistance. So let me begin today then by flagging in advance the dangers of foreclosing on resistance. And then I'll just offer up 3 frames with which we might consider the relationships between representation and rebellion, or aesthetics and transformation now. So the first category then is, to quote Star Trek, resistance is futile. Now, if we were a little bit more technologically advanced here, I would have shown you a clip right now of a great Star Trek episode where the good ship Enterprise encounters a group called the Borg. And what the Borg do is they take over your body and speak as you. So the Borg tell the Star Trek crew via their own captain, who they have taken over, that resistance is futile, and that via assimilation, the Borg will, quote, add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture, they tell Captain Cook, will now adapt to service ours. So they're like neoliberalism, absorbing what is unique and creative about the humans that they meet to transform it into a new mode of power. It's a lot like a university administration, for example, where they take all of the innovative energies of its professors and transform them only into new ways of returning revenue to the neoliberal university. So there's something very suggestive about this Borg metaphor. So I would identify one camp in the aesthetics and resistance domain as the Borg camp, the people who say resistance is futile. And that would be people of the capitalist realist school of thought. These are Zizhakian thinkers like Zizek, but also like Mark Fisher. Now, according to their logic, every articulation of resistance, particularly if it comes about in the realm of popular culture, all it does is contribute to an illusion that we stupid people have of freedom and potential. And what popular culture does, according to Mark Fisher, who wrote a book called Capitalist Realism, is it dots the landscape with texts that, quote, perform your anti-capitalism for you. And this is a very cynical understanding of viewership, that you're quite happy to have your politics performed for you by a popular TV show or narrative or something, that you no longer need to perform it yourself. So Fisher uses examples from Pixar movies being a big favorite topic of mine that I have written a lot about. And he sees, for example, WALL-E as, with its critique of the bloated humans who are just, floating around in space, as not real critiques of capitalism or of environmental decay or of human-centric philosophy, but just a performance of those anti-capitalist sentiments that makes the audience feel good that the sentiments have been expressed at all. Zizek makes a similar move in relationship to Kung Fu Panda, a very important text that I'm sure we're all familiar with, to argue that all animated films for children just install in kids cultural cliches about being themselves and dreaming big. So what I like to say in response to that, to Zizek, is, while I may not disagree with you on your reading of authoritarian democracy, I strenuously disagree about Kung Fu Panda. And now is not the time to really go into that, except to say, and I'll come back to this in a moment, that maybe of the only genre in the marketplace of ideas that we currently subscribe to, where you will find actual images of mass rebellion, is children's narratives, and particularly animated films. And animated films actually have evolved to create they created an algorithm by which early animated films could actually show mass rebellion. So, they're often about social insects like ants or like bees or like fish. And they needed an algorithm to show us a mass that was differentiated from within. Do you see what I mean? Because in the past, if you wanted to show many mice or many rats or many fish, you drew one fish and repeated it, one rat or repeated it. But that's not actually the meaning of a crowd. A crowd is many in difference, and that's actually something that Pixar developed as an algorithm. Now, we could be super cynical and just say, oh, great, they have an algorithm for that, and then they make hundreds of millions of dollars from representing our rebellion to us in really legible and convincing ways. But I think we don't want to be so cynical, particularly given that these images flood into the marketplace of children's culture, right? So it's children who are absorbing these actually very intricate messages of rebellion. And I'll come back to that in a second. So that's my first point, is let's not subscribe to the resistance is futile narrative. Let's not subscribe with Zizek to the idea that we as intellectuals complete the work of capitalism. So we theorize our own resubjugation when we are in the classroom or in the seminar, which is what capitalist realists do. I think as intellectuals, we have some obligation to actually work with the small openings for resistance that we are given wherever we may find them. So the second structure that I'm interested in we'll call intellectual emancipation after Rancière. So the tidiness that the Borgs, remember in Star Trek, attribute to cultural production, the seamless ways in which all capitalist realism absorbs dissent, can be countered with a view of aesthetics that understands some cultural production as resistant in its messy, untidy, unruly, and wild renderings of culture. And this is what Rancière calls intellectual emancipation, where we can work with any text. We don't need a canonical set of texts with which to work. We can find the kinds of readings that we're interested in everywhere. We should be able to, at least. We shouldn't require a Virginia Woolf to make an argument about resistance. We should be able to do it via Kung Fu Panda. Let's just to give a random example, right? So Rancière, in terms that are almost the exact opposite of Zizek, proposes that the mode of learning that we've insisted upon in the university is what contributes to a certain kind of intellectual stupefaction. And that's a hierarchized notion of learning where the university exists not simply to teach students, but to continually authorize the power of the professor as the one who knows. And so it's invested in expository lessons and the close readings where the professor is able to show the students that they did not know what he knows. So the university in the past has been set up on behalf of mastery, but in order to move forward and be in this very dynamic relationship to a new set of formal aesthetic principles for representation, we have to renege on mastery and look again to concepts like failure, for example. So if we're living in a time of crisis, and we're always living in a time of crisis, but we've been told to speak to our particular crisis, one that's manufactured by an overwhelming emphasis on money, the economy, work, and business, then this is not the time to mount a vigorous defense of high culture, of the traditional texts of literature, on genius or expertise. Nor is it time to emphasize a canon or dig into idealizations of the book or print culture and excoriations of screen and digital culture. Instead, our current crisis affords an opportunity to rethink the ways in which our institutions may in fact prohibit rather than promote learning by severing us from alternative modes of learning that we may need for this particular moment. So the focus on the individual, on genius, on expertise is completely, I would say, outmoded and bankrupt. So in this moment, then, I would argue for unlearning, and this is what I do in my book, In the Queer Art of Failure, propose that we should undiscipline ourselves, think separately from the training that the disciplines have given us. We all read our Foucault. We understand that discipline produces docility to a certain degree, and yet we cling to the disciplines as if the disciplines are the only route to knowledge, when in fact the disciplines are the route to social stability and to making sure that we don't change anything about the relationship between, let's say, aesthetics and resistance. The novel itself developed at a moment of great instability in the late 18th, early 19th century, developed alongside capitalism, almost as a record of those new understandings of subjectivity, self, community, and value. And at the time was seen as a very suspicious form, as novel, as new in a way that people were not sure that they trusted in terms of conventional modes of learning. So we don't want to now use the novel, which is no longer novel, right? Use the novel as a way to delegitimize new conventional modes of media. And some of the best work in terms of fiction writing today, I think, is really writing about the end of a certain world that the novel was able to encapsulate. So you could think of someone like Zadie Smith, who wrote On Beauty, in which she rewrote E.M. Forster's Howard's End, but takes what is implicit in that book and makes it explicit, which is we are at the end of a particular organization of knowledge that takes the white man as its focus, colonialism as its practice, and capitalism as its common sense. We're at the end of that era, and so she writes, in a way, always about these endings. Julian Barnes, also the sense of an ending. There are many of these novels about endings. Ian McEwan's On Chesil Beach is about the end of Englishness, which takes the form of a failed and pathetic heterosexual liaison on a horrible little seaside town in England. These are really interesting, in fact, statements about the end of something, the end of potentially everything. So there's my pitch for intellectual emancipation, different forms of knowing, disorganizations of knowledge, rejection of the disciplines, a refusal to retreat to this idea that we must go back to canons of thought and orderly understandings of the procession of knowledge across the centuries. So instead, my last section is called Impossible Architectures. And here I want to think with some new forms of representation about how to do knowledge differently. And I think it falls to us as intellectuals also to think about what it means to be the people who, in the realm of cultural capital, are the 1%, are the people who still have had an education, have had a certain kind of education, and therefore have a different relationship to the production of culture and knowledge in the first place. So I have 3 texts that, just by way of conclusion, I offer up that would not usually be talked about, is my guess, and probably will not be talked about by any of our other guests in relationship to aesthetics and resistance. And the first is a brilliant animated film from 2 years ago called The Lego Movie. Anyone see the Lego Movie? 3 of us, awesome. Counts as avant-garde then, I think. And, these animated films for children, they're sort of made for children, but there's a presumption that the child doesn't go alone to the movies, and therefore there are always little, concessions made to the adult viewer. But the Lego Movie is really, very much of the genre of the animated film. And the animated film has to appeal, remember, to the child viewer. The child viewer is not the adult viewer. The child viewer does not want to be enlightened. The child viewer does not want to be improved. The child viewer does not require that the movie deliver romance at the end, some happy resolution, some humanist cliche. The child viewer, in fact, lives in a world that is very different from the adult world. Children, for example, are not romantic subjects. They do not live in the couple form. They struggle with the family form. And for the most part, they live collective lives. And, you see this when you see little kids on the street in New York City maybe tethered together, right, as they are moved from one part of the city to the other, and they don't want to lose a child, so they connect them with these tethers. It looks a little like a chain gang, but at the same time, which reminds us of the bondage of childhood, but it also reminds us that children live in a world where the individual is not everything, and where there's a kind of utopian possibility that's inscribed in their social existence. So these animated films have to actually speak to that. So just to give you a sense of that, this is a great example, the Lego Movie. So in the Lego Movie, you have this world of Legoburg subjects who are happily all named as sort of vernacular architects. They are able, as is the way with Lego, to build and rebuild their world every day. Every day they tear their worlds apart, and every day they rebuild them. Now, there has to be conflict, right? So conflict comes in the form of Mr. President Business is how he's called. President Business, right? You never would find such a clearly, villainous person in a film for people over the age of 7, who's called President Business. This is the allegory, right? So President Business is wielding a very, very powerful tool, super glue. And he proposes to glue the city into one shape and prevent these recombinations and assemblages that the citizens of Legoburg understand to be their daily purpose. Okay? So this is really sad. It's this like wonderful concept of the making of a world that we engage in every single day, that in order for the workforce to be made more productive, President Business decides to bring a halt to this. So that's one frame, and then there's an outside frame. I won't bore you with all the details. I would, but there isn't time. But the outside frame is a father playing with his children, and the father is building Lego worlds that look exactly like the world he lives in. And they're fantastic, but they look exactly like the world he lives in. And the kids are like, why would you build that, right? And they are building unrecognizable worlds that he says are impossible. He's like, well, but that's impossible. So on this idea of impossible architecture, I want to, kind of build for us the concept of an aesthetics of resistance that is about making and unmaking the world every day on behalf of an impossible architecture, one that cannot be imagined. Emma Goldman, for example, says in an essay about anarchism, she said, well, people say anarchism isn't practical. So what would be the point if it was practical? There's absolutely no point in imagining a future that can already easily be thought of under current conditions. What we want to do is imagine something utterly impractical that breaks with current conditions on the way to something else. So my final examples of this impossible architecture, 2 video games that are made for any kind of player, children or adults. One is a beautiful, whimsical little game called Thomas Was Alone. Has anyone played Thomas Was Alone? Just me. Jack was alone, that's fine. And the conceit is that these geometric shapes have been released as artificial intelligences into a virtual world. And they want to find their way out. And they know the way in which the world has been built by the person they call the architect, but they also believe that there are weaknesses in the architecture, and the weaknesses are what they want to exploit. At the beginning of the game, Thomas is alone, but as he moves through the system, he encounters more and more people. And each shape has a different skill. And it is only by working together that they're able to work their way through the system and find the glitch in the matrix that lets them out. The other example of this is Monument Valley, which is a beautiful, painterly virtual world in which a princess navigates an impossible architecture, and that's what it's called, or a sacred geometry, looking only for wisdom. So she meets a genie every now and then, and the genie gives her something, we don't know what, and she grows from this wisdom and continues on her way, right? Now, these games are actually often critiqued in mainstream circles for being too easy and not competitive. And people are like, well, I got through the game really quickly. There was nothing to it for me, right? But actually the games offer something that we used to associate with high culture, which is the possibility of contemplation, staying with something beautiful and staying in it only for the sake of being in this impossible architecture for a moment. Something that doesn't make sense, something that doesn't lead anywhere, something that doesn't tell you anything, something that has no lessons to give you, but the accumulated wisdom of going along routes that you have not been before, right? So it may well be that if we have any inclination, and I think we probably don't, to reinstitute the high-low binary, that we are missing the point which is that really complex aesthetics have gone elsewhere and are embedded in these systems that we sometimes reject or we sneer at or we think are for somebody else, but are full of longing and melancholy, different notions of being together inside a frame and looking for an exit, right? Different ways of conceiving of space, of intimacy, of loss, and of meaning itself. So to conclude then, against capitalist realist messages of futility and submission, we can offer the fantasy of impossible architectures and sacred geometries, virtual realms where sentient shapes and lost princesses on a quest for other worlds where forgiveness is not necessary, simultaneity and improvisation are rewarded, and unlearning creates new paths through forbidden territories. Wildness, wonder, and sheer pleasure are at the heart of an aesthetics of resistance. And like the lonely square in Thomas Was Alone and the seeking princess in Monument Valley, we must embrace an aesthetic that positions resistance in terms that do not announce their own radicality in advance, but instead reveal it slowly, level by level, one step at a time, into the unknown. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great introduction to our topic. And as I said before, I want to make one remark without asking a question, because then we would immediately lose ourselves in discussion. I found it very interesting that you alluded to the idea of high modernism and the idea that cultural literature has to be difficult. And the emancipation that you described opposes that in taking the side of low culture, low literature, low theory, as you said. I think this endeavor of modernism, of difficulty, has also been very true of theory itself. Since Adorno, ever since, theory had to be difficult, and I wonder if something like simple theory exists. It makes me think of Deleuze and Guattari, who in the 70s meant to produce theory for children. As a matter of fact, I think Guattari in an interview once said that the Anti-Oedipus had been written for an audience between 7 and 14. I'm not sure he succeeded, though. So how could theory look like which refrains from being difficult? But we have to move on, and maybe we can come back to these issues. I'm here to introduce our next speaker, Armen Avanesian. For Berlin audience, Armen is known for his contributions to accelerationism and for the invention of speculative poetics, a concept that seeks to explore the power of language and literature in and for contemporary thought. Nevertheless, and maybe ironically, Armen has been particularly present in the art world, in Berlin and elsewhere, where his publications are widely acclaimed. It has been even suspected that his astonishing productivity as a writer might itself be an artistic performance. Among his many books are Irony and the Logic of Modernity, Präsens, Poetik eines Tempus, and most recently Überschrift, about the crisis of the contemporary university. He has also collaborated with various artists, and tomorrow, Saturday evening at 7, I think, his film Hyperstition will premiere in Babylon Kino in Mitte, a film that he has made together with the filmmaker and artist Christopher Roth. Armen, it's your word.
Thanks for the kind introduction. The film is actually tomorrow at 11 a.m., so don't party hard. It's worth going there, free admission. I've been like still working on the film. It's always good to start with excuses before you speak. And I wanted to speak, of course, about Thomas Was Alone and the Lego movie. So now I have to improvise. Anyhow, so thanks to the organizers really for the whole festival they put together every year. And also just for my personal, there's some personal gratitude. I was really like happy to be with these prestigious other speakers on the panel, who some of them are really important already back in the days when I was writing my PhD on irony. So it's a great pleasure and honor. And I think I need some water. So and starting to think about like what I have to talk about, and especially these other panelists. Of course, Derrida came into my mind, and thinking about him. This is like a dangerous area here. So about like Derrida, who influenced quite a lot of us, I guess, and his way of thinking and his way of reading, and how much it came from learning from literature, and not so much particularly from this and that like novel or author, but a certain one could maybe criticize high modernist literature that influenced him. Maybe that's also a limitation of your thinking. So my first idea was really to do a kind of pastiche or Derridian kind of talk, because what you do when you're not sure what you should talk about, you Google a bit around and see how the event is announced. And it's really fascinating. I mean, to just check it out. There are at least 20 versions this event was announced. So, but and mainly it was about like the countries where people come from, you know. So sometimes it was like Spivak, and then it was USA, and then some people said like, okay, India and USA, and then they felt obliged to also put like Garcia Düttmann with Spain and not just Germany, you know. And then eventually I got like Austrian and German, but it's like so many different variations and so on. Anyhow, but I'm digressing. I might come back to it. So what's interesting about Derrida is really that it's a kind of a reading and a writing that made him also like that changed the way he was thinking, seeing, and also the way somehow what made him a kind of political thinker, and not so much an aesthetics, but maybe, and that will be a bit my point today, a certain poetics. So a poetics, a theory of practice and theory of writing and reading. And my question would be, or what's always haunting me, is like, what would be, without sounding arrogant, what would be a poetics for today? You know, like with a very different political, technological, but also cultural situations. So, as you'll hear in my talk, I'm a bit wary about like aesthetics, and especially whether it's that literature, I think, should be careful with aesthetics. So it's important to stress that I really believe in the need, but also in the possibility of change and transformation. But I'm skeptic about the way we got used to think about criticism or criticality or resistance within this dominance of aesthetics, and I'll soon explain what I mean by that. As Philip already mentioned, I'm recently quite often invited in like an art context or and there's a kind of ongoing desire by organizers to get the philosopher in that then has a kind of legitimizing function of explaining or legitimating like why this whole, whatever it is, performance, film, artworks has got some kind of criticality or a political importance or subversive quality. And I'm very doubtful whether it really has. And the field of like contemporary art or the field also literature really does have a progressive impact on our society, which it always wants or claims sometimes. So I do not want to deny that it has an impact on how when we read a novel, for example, how we feel or maybe how we think, but whether it changes our action. And or the most important thing is whether it really, a theory, gains traction in reality. So that's what I'm really doubtful about. Saying that, it means, of course, at the same time that we have to be like self-critical and gotta really admit that the kind of theory we produce, but also the art or literature we produce in the last decades, simply doesn't work or is not good enough. At least if we take resistance as a criteria, which we should do at least today. So it's an absolutely important first step, even if it's unpleasant, that we have to admit our failure up to a certain extent, that the strategies of the last decades do not work. The artistic, literary, but also, in my case, academic strategies don't work. But as I said, I don't want to come across as a total pessimist, and at the end of my talk, I'll try to come up with some at least horizons, how one could consider change. Anyhow, but I want to start with aesthetics, and again, this comes from reading and rereading the announcement a bit, because one of the things I was really struck by was this kind of aesthetics of resistance. In German, it's like Ästhetik des Widerstands, or Ästhetiken des Widerstands, so it's not so clear whether resistance has an aesthetics or whether kind of different aesthetics have all different kind of modes of resistance and so on. But then there was another element of whether it's like art of resistance, you know? So there's a kind of identification of aesthetics and art as if the two are the same thing. So whenever I see this kind of coming together of two terms that as if they are the same, you know, I get the impression, or I'm a bit suspicious whether there's a kind of ideology bell ringing like in my head. So especially in the case of literature, I want to say that it's important to distinguish literature, or think about literature in a different way. Now, I was told to speak 20 minutes and not 20 hours, so I can't go into details like into the genealogy of this discipline of aesthetics. But what's important, that was like founded around 1800 or so. But I think it's important just to stress one element, namely a certain relation between reason and a strong emphasis on perception, on aesthesis in aesthetics. And with it goes, especially in contemporary culture or contemporary art, a cult of vagueness, of the non-identifier, das Nicht-Identische with Adorno. And the aesthetic experience, a kind of democratic promise. I think with the rise of importance, or nearly the hegemony of contemporary art, or the image culture, think of Instagram and so on, this has become an absolute hegemonic way of thinking. And hence the inflationary use, if ever you read a kind of catalog text in art, but also like about contemporary novels, you'll always get these phrases: making aware, showing an interest, increasing the sensibility, producing awareness, provoking, making visible, in all these terms, but it's never clear what exactly becomes visible. It's never clear what's exactly understood. It's not clear how precisely we should act. It's just these vague terms. So, and whether this or that aesthetic experience actually has any impact on the global problems, because that's what the organizers really state very correctly. We are dealing with global problems here. So that never becomes clear. So basically there's loads of criticism, or so-called criticality, but not so much proper resistance. And that's at least partly because there's such a dislike, I think, in contemporary culture and also literature for abstraction and conceptual sharpness that I think would be necessary for precise cognitive mapping of the political situation we're in. So my second point is, in a way, that there is a kind of aestheticization of how we think, not just about art, but also about literature, and unfortunately also about the capacity for political resistance. I say unfortunately because given the general aestheticization of our private life, our cities, even our economy, as a kind of Dolby surround aestheticization we live in, so to say, I think that some even more aesthetics won't do the trick, won't help us. It's just more of the same, but I'm sure we can discuss that with Jack afterwards. So according to Walter Benjamin, as you all know, I'm sure, aestheticization of politics was the sign of fascism. Today's aestheticization of our lives and works, on the other hand, makes us fit for a kind of neoliberal post-democracy we're slowly sliding into. We are all thoughtful subjects, clever, receptive to others, responsive to new conditions, creative producers of values, flexible, original, and so on. I could go on with this list forever. So basically, we are all little artists of our everyday life and work. And the problem with this aesthetic ideology is that this ideology is also dominant or hegemonic in the world of theory, in academia, or at least in the humanities. Because that should also be the topic, I think, today. What role does literature or art what kind of impact does it has on us who do theory or philosophy? So in the book that Philip was so kind to mention, that I wrote on university, I dealt with this kind of topics and observation that there's a kind of trend in academia to deal with politics as long as it's really, really far away, but hardly dealing with the kind of politics we work in, with our concrete working situation. So I was very interested in the possibilities of different, more experimental ways of writing, reading, how do our seminars look like, what kind of qualification papers do we have to write. And it's not by coincidence that at the time aesthetics was invented, also a modern research university was invented. I'll just give you one example. One innovation of this kind of new university, namely the transformation, the change from a kind of oral disputation, where you had to prove that you're you can talk about the canon of what happened before, to something very new, namely the written dissertation, where you had to prove that you are original, that you can invent things, that you're innovative, and so on. So this kind of aesthetic move, I was really interested in. What we see today is a very formatted way of how we write our papers, how we write our dissertations. It's a bit like the 3-minute kind of pop song kind of regulation, you know, which is also, I think, to a high degree responsible or co-responsible for the kind of nearly depression that so many of us are haunted by. So another thing we witnessed today in the last few decades, especially in the 21st century, is a theory of, and now I come back to literature, is a series of theoretical turns, a materialist turn, a cognitive turn, a media turn, a visual turn, and so on. And what they all share, what they all have in common, though all they disagree in many other respects, is that they are against the linguistic or semiotic turn. So there's a turn against the linguistic or against language. And so basically what I want to make you aware of, that there are two things that go together. One, that there's a whole paradigm of thinking, namely structuralism or post-structuralism, which defined the 20th century, and that gets more and more marginalized today. So that's the one thing. And the second thing is that with the rise of contemporary art in our culture, and just open any kind of newspaper and compare it with 10 years ago. How many reviews of novels you get, and how many you got 10 years ago, at the expense of this and that record-breaking auction at this and that art fair or so. So these two things, I think, go together. The marginalization of a certain paradigm that was related to literature, structuralism, and the diminishing of importance of literature. Now, there's a big danger of, or there's a kind of trap that many academics tend to fall in, this kind of battle for marginalization, you know, everyone wants to, even I could come up I'm marginalized because actually I'm half Armenian, and that was not mentioned in any of the announcement. Or there was one thing that was actually I just realized when Philip was talking about introducing our names, the one thing that was really stable was the order of names. It was always Spivak, Halberstam, Dutman, and then Mcewan, which could be ladies first, or it could be an exotism, India is really far away, or it could be a kind of dodgy kind of alphabetical order the other way around, or it could be the good old harsh capitalist logic of power and knowledge and institutional power. I guess I'm the only one who hasn't got a kind of institutional kind of professorship and so on. But what do we gain from this kind of battle for being marginal? Not so much, you know. We don't learn anything, and the most important thing is we don't learn. We might gain advantages for us, but we don't learn how to change anything. So maybe another thing we could talk about is the example of Occupy. So I think what's really needed is that we need to learn to win again, and not just prove how poor we are, or disadvantages, which many of us are, you know. But anyhow, I was digressing, obviously. I got carried away a bit. So anyhow, what I want to get at is, what I'm interested in is how a literature or theory or philosophy, learning from literature, can actually really have an impact given the global problems that we are facing. And these problems are not just global, but they are highly abstract and technological. So let me just mention 3 of them apart from the climate change. One is the changes in our economy, especially the new speculative financial model or the fact that we entered something like what I call a derivative paradigm. The second is surveillance and all the problematic of big data. And the third one is changes within technology, especially nanotechnology. Now, how many minutes have I got left? A few. Mm.
5 minutes.
I was hoping time is over and I can pretend that I have answers to nanotechnology. And invite myself for next year because I want to write about this more extensively. Anyhow, so the 3 topics. I start with the derivative paradigm. I got to read that because the numbers are so impressive. So the notional total value of the derivative market at the end of 2012 was $694 trillion. Now compare this to the $71 trillion of the global market value of the real economy, like of goods and services, and you will start to understand why we live in something like a derivative paradigm, 10 times the volume. And it's not just the sheer numbers, but also a distinct temporality that comes with it, namely that the present in this derivative paradigm is totally emptied out. First of all, because it's mainly done by high-frequency trading, so no human being can somehow interfere. It's milliseconds or even less. And the second element here is that the present is governed in a way from the future. Or to be precise, the present is governed by assumptions about the future. On a large scale, we all know that. You all witnessed the crisis about in Greece. So it's certain assumptions, or is it the AAA or whatever kind of evaluation of a country. If a country loses that, automatically it has an impact. The imagination that this and that might happen in the future has immediately an impact in the present. But also on a smaller level, think of prices of individual goods or stocks in general. They are set via assumptions from the future. So what we have to learn from this is that we no longer live in a kind of chronological time where the past, so to say, influences the present, and then in the present we somehow shape the future. Instead, we live in something like a non-chronological time. We got to understand that the future time, that the time is coming in a way from the future, in a very real way. And this, and that's very important, is something that literature is able to understand and deal with like no other art. And one of the books that Philip mentioned was like I worked a lot on tense, or the invention of like novels that are written in the present tense in the 20th century. Not just high novels, but like also in like so-called low novels. But if you take the most basic sentence, like the next day Philip went shopping, you immediately realize this is a fictional sentence, you know, like the next day is in the future, went is in the past tense. So by reading literature, or in literature, we have something very specific, namely a constant grammatical or linguistic play with different tenses that make us, I can't go into detail here, but that gives us a unique possibility to think about this speculative temporality or this derivative paradigm we live in a way. The second thing is the big data question, and I'll be really brief here. Here the question is how this abundance of data becomes meaningful, how it gets significance. And that is in itself, again, a poetic question, not an aesthetic one. Me personally, I'm skeptical whether we will be able to avoid continuing all this data. All of you, I guess most of you know it, if there are 5 points today in the city where you somehow paid or went online and so on, you can be traced. It knows who you are in a way. So this will, I'm very skeptical that we can avoid that in the future. So this idea of privacy, of hiding or hidden visibility, we might have to give up. And I think it's really a kind of aesthetical dilemma or an aesthetical vicious circle, this obsession with, on the one hand, visibility, and on the other hand, having to deal with this hypervisibility. And we won't find a way out just thinking about it in aesthetic terms. Instead of this aesthetical way of dealing with the question, the point is, I think, to learn from data, from the data that is what data already knows about us. So it's a question of learning how to read all this data that exists. Because, and this is my argument here, data is not in itself meaningful. It's only depending on this or that algorithm that needs to be written. So writing, again, is very important. I just did a book with, on finance, and it was really fascinating. Whomever you speak with, they all stress the importance of writing, whether it's the writing of prices, whether it's the writing of like making specific financial decisions, whether it's the writing of algorithms. They never talk about like seeing or visibility. So I just wanted to briefly mention that also here literature, writing or poetics becomes relevant when thinking about something like a poetics, not an aesthetics, a poetics of resistance. And my last example, even briefer, is on the level of technology or nanotechnology, where I think we have an even clearer relevance of poetics or poetics, as I call it, poiesis, understood as both a practice but also creation of a space or a space of truth. So what you see in nanotechnology is really an overcoming of a 1,000-year-old tradition that philosophers call the hylomorphotic tradition. So on the one hand, you have like a matter that then afterwards gets like changed by form. There's lots of feminist work being done on that, but also Derrida, this idea of Mother Earth, and then the male logos or so comes and shapes it in a way. So this is completely destroyed or deconstructed by nanotechnology. And what we have here is an idea that the forming happens not afterwards, but really on the level of matter itself. It's matter itself that gets reconstructed in nanotechnology. So there's a kind of poiesis of matter, a creation, a construction of matter, and not a different perception we get from afterwards shaping matter in a different way. So again, without going into details here, I just wanted to give you a glimpse of why, how, and where literature and poetics will hopefully have a bigger impact in the upcoming future at the expense of aesthetics, but really not on the level of content of this or that drama play or novel. Basically, I think we have to think about technology also in our times, and especially when it comes to resistance, we have got to think about technology in its poetic or poetic dimension. And all this in order for an actual resistance and not just a theoretical one. In short, and I end with this, instead of focusing about how we perceive the world or how we feel about it, it's about getting real traction in the world by understanding and changing or reprogramming or rewriting the technologies that actually do shape the world. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I've been trying to connect the two talks that we heard, and I see something very similar and something very not similar in them. And I want to mention that because that could maybe also later lead us into our discussion. On the one side, I think we heard two rejections and critiques of a certain cultural tradition that is connected to the fact that we have to or want to be artists, that is connected to the category of genius, geniality, which you locate, and that is interesting, within the universities of German origin, early 19th century, where the professor on the one hand is a state servant, but at the other time, he is being installed by the Prussian bureaucracy as a genius, somebody who... Wissenschaftskünstler, right, yeah. And Bill Clark, I think, has also written an interesting book about it. So there I see a similarity in your critique. On the other hand, Armin makes a very strong difference between the visible and the legible, the image and the word, art and literature, visual art and literature, which I think for Jack was not an important category. Your difference seemed to be more maybe between the high and the low. That could be that works for both domains, and your main examples were real films and video games that you might see as part of what you call the aesthetic regime. So that brings us also back to this main question about literature, and if we can talk about literature in a specific way that is different or opposes literature to art, to the visual arts, which seem to be dominating our theoretical discourse, contemporary discourse on resistance and politics. So much from my side. Thank you very much. We have the first break coming along, but it's only 15 minutes long.